Hello guys. How are you? This is my first video, so I hope you enjoy. Aldera Junior High is one of the many middle schools that are throughout Japan. Today was the last day of school as summer break was nearing close, with the third year being about to be graduating only in a couple of hours. As many had no real idea of their future ahead, others had only one thing in mind, the only job that would be right for them. Changing the view to a certain class, the students were all chatting among each other, while most of them, as in the back of the class, a single boy with green hair was sitting there in silence. His head was down on the desk, and his eyes had bags under them, a clear sign of fatigue and exhaustion. Soon, the door opened as a male teacher entered the class, having a stack of paper in his hand. Walking to his desk, he flipped his stack of sheets, waving it around. Looking at the class, it was clear that he couldn't hide his excitement for his students, or was it just for himself? Either way, the class was now in session, the class being silent under the next minute. Alright class, today marked your last day as middle school students. Most of the class cheered as they were yelling in ecstasy, delighted that school was almost over. But unfortunately, it wasn't over yet. The green-haired boy put his hands over his ears, getting mildly annoyed by the commotion in the class, his eyes struggling to keep open. No one seemed to pay attention to him as the teacher continued, waving the stack of paper. I'll be handing these for your future career. It's time that you decide on what to do with your future. But, in a sudden movement, the teacher threw the stack of paper in the air, grinning excitedly as he looked at his students like this was obvious. I know you all want to become heroes. As most of the class celebrated those words, they all activated their special abilities, quirks. Those powers could vary from user to user, never being the same as most of the population had those. It could be as useless as to have a longer nose, all the way to create and control fire. Well, considering the quirks this class has to offer, the world would most likely be doomed with such useless heroes. As everyone keeps celebrating with their quirks being used, even against the rules, two guys were just sitting there in silence. But looking at them both, it's as if they were complete opposites. While the green hair boy was just silently snoring on his desk, trying to get some sleep, the other one had a frown on his face as his hands were making a slight popping sound. The boy looked annoyed at the class, looking down at every one of them, but he stayed in his seat. He knew that using quirks in public without permission was forbidden, which is why he refrained. Now class, you know very well that quirks in public are prohibited, but I'll let it slide for the moment. I know you are all excited for your future as heroes, the teacher snorted, finding it amusing that these people could be heroes, but he couldn't just shatter their dreams. He still has his role as a teacher. But two students here applied to UA. As these words blurted out of the teacher's mouth, the class quickly became quiet, as the students whispered to each other about this special school. From the whispers that were going around, it was obvious that it was one heck prestigious school. As the rumors go, UA had an acceptance rate of 0.01% as only the best of the best attend this prestigious hero school. All the students that attend there have a certified place to be a top-rate hero when they graduate. There are other hero schools of course throughout Japan, but UA is the one that everyone wants to attend. The teacher cleared his throat as he gets the first applicant, looking at a spiky blonde guy with a proud smile somehow. One of them is Katsuki Bakugu. It's no surprise seeing the efficiency and potential of his quirk. His physical score is also quite impressive, adding to that he's one of the top scorers in the academic field. I'm sure you'll be in with no problem, Mr. Bakugu. It was no wonder that this kid would apply to a school like this. Those were the kind of things that the kids in the class were mumbling to each other. It was exactly why he was chosen by the school to attend this school, but there's just one little problem that goes with that. The student in question suddenly put his feet on his desk as he stood up, pointing his fist in the air, showing a grin filled with pride, and looking down at everyone in the class. Taking a deep breath, he began to shout to the whole class. That's right. I'm the only one worthy enough out of y'all losers to be in this school. This is my stepping stone to my deserved fame, as I'll be even more popular than All Might. I'll be the greatest hero ever. As Bakugu was about to continue his rant over his greatness, the teacher interrupted him as he looked at the other paper and said a name that put the whole class in silence. Oh, it seems Mr. Midoriya is also tempting his chance. He's got the grades, that's for sure, but, stopping in his words, the teacher had a slight smirk, fully knowing what was about to unfold. He snorted as he put the paper on his desk, looking at what is about to happen. Meanwhile, Katsuki's face goes into drastic changes, as his grin of pride quickly turned into a scowl of pure hatred as he turned to the desk of the green-haired boy, who was sleeping during all this. His palm made a popping sound that just intensified over the seconds, as he finally slammed his palm to the boy's desk, creating a mild explosion. This explosion sent the kid to the wall, and a slight sound of crack was heard, making the boy's eyes go wide, getting his breath back. "Deku, you worthless loser. How could you apply to UA? Are you trying to stand in my way?" Cackling explosion in the palm of his hand, Bakugo was approaching the boy dangerously as Izuku looked up. As for his point of view, everyone was seen as shadows with bright red eyes. Gasping for air, he had his hand on his chest, trying to get his breathing back to normal. There was a slight moment of hesitation in Katsuki's eyes, but it was quickly dissipated by the anger that the boy was feeling at the moment. As the green-haired boy's body was trembling in fear, he tried to back off in fear, only for his back to hit the wall behind him. His eyes had a clear look of panic. Despite those alarming signs, no one went to his aid, as even some were taking their phone to register the whole event, with the others laughing to his extent. "Kaken. Please let me explain, this isn't what it looks like. I just thought that, I could try my shot there, it doesn't hurt to try," but Bakugo wasn't taking any of that as he sent another explosion at the boy, but it hit the wall near him instead. Katsuki's grin looked so evil from Izuku's perspective as he pointed at him. "You're a quirkless loser, Deku. You'll never accomplish anything, you'll die in the exam." As Katsuki was holding Izuku's collar firmly, ready to blast him with his quirk, the voice of the teacher was heard in the background. But even so, it didn't sound quite convincing. "Alright Bakugo, I know you're excited to be enrolled in UA, but no need to eliminate the competition so soon." Despite those words, the teacher was snickering looking at the two, not even feeling sorry for Izuku. As Bakugo was going to his desk, Izuku tried to stand up, but the damage on his back was putting a toll on his body. "Come on Mr. Midoriya, the floor isn't a seat, go back to your desk before I put you in detention." Having no choice, Izuku put the pain at the back of his head and tried his hardest to walk the couple of steps he needed to reach his desk. Afterward, the class resumed and soon enough, the bell for lunch was ringing, meaning that they had about an hour of lunch. As everyone was going with their friends having their fun, it was only Izuku in the class he sighed. Seeing that everyone already left the room, he stood up and with a slow pace, he exited the room. As he walked the hallway, he could feel the stares of the other students and even from the teachers. As the only quirkless of the school, it wasn't an easy life he was leading. The laugh coming from the others filled his ear and resonated in his head, only wanting them to cease. He tried to accelerate his pace, but each step he was making made his back hurt like hell. I need to hurry." Going out of his way, he finally arrived inside an empty classroom that wasn't used for a while, seeing the dust that had accumulated. Locking the door behind him, Izuku walked a little longer, until he lay against a wall, not wanting to move anymore. "Why you can come now." Izuku says this in a hushed tone, trying to subside the pain, but it still hurt a lot for him. It was just then that a black cat went out of his open backpack, crawling to the boy. Its golden eyes stared in contemplation at him. It then grew in size and changed form, until a black-haired woman with golden irises appeared in front of him, on her fore as she looked at him in worry. With a sad frown, she made him put his stomach against the floor as his back was shown to her. With his uniform still on, she went on top of him as her face leaned to his ear, whispering, "Come on Izuku, you know I can't perform my sage art if you have your clothes on." With beet red face, Izuku turned his head to her as there was a second of hesitation, but it was merely a second, as he started to unbutton his uniform, showing his bruised back to her. He didn't hold back. The woman had two cat tails behind her and cat ears that were matching. Her golden irises were staring at his back as she began to take off her clothes slowly. Izuku stared at the ground, his face fully flushed. Do you need to be naked for this, Kuroka?" The woman named Kuroka giggled as she lay down on his back. Izuku hissed at the touch but relaxed after a moment. She went near his face as her tongue touched his cheek and licked him a good amount. With a sly smirk on her face, she had her hands on his back, rubbing him gently. "The more skin contact there is, the fastest the healing process will be. I don't make the rules, dear." Laying down her body on his, Kuroka's chest was rubbing against his bruised back, making Izuku squirms, but he didn't push her off. He let her do what she wanted, not interrupting her much. Even so, she makes it hard for him as the gentle touch of her fingers tracing the skin of his back and her tongue running along the bruises was too much for the boy to handle. Izuku's body emitted a faint light as the bruises were slowly decreasing in size, and Kuroka was still touching his back, grinding her body against his as if she were playing with him. During this whole time, the boy tried to hold back his voice. He had to admit that her touch felt almost heavenly, or was it hellish? Whatever it was, he had a hard time handling it. Since the injuries were mostly minor, the process didn't last that much as after half an hour, there was still a slight pain that was exerting on his body, but most of it was now gone as Kuroka was still laying down on him. Her head was just next to his and her eyes were looking at him with some sort of admiration. Izuku had his eyes close, but he felt her presence nonetheless as there was a light pink blush spreading across his cheeks. The Nakomata couldn't help but smile as she poked his cheeks. At this moment, she showed a genuine smile as she too closed her eyes, laying on him. While this happened, Izuku's soft voice was heard. "Kuroka, you think I could be a hero?" It was the only thing she heard from him, but she sensed the desperation for an answer in his voice. She couldn't help but feel bad for him, having no one accepting his ideals and dreams, leaving it to himself, if it wasn't for her. If she hasn't been there for him, who knows what the boy would have been through, or if he would even survive the constant aggressive encounter with that explosive boy. She wasn't always there for him, but every time she spent time with the boy, she makes sure that no harm is made to him, and that he could at least have those moments of happiness in his life. As Izuku sat up, Kuroka straddled him in with her on his lap. Her hands were around his neck, her face was close to him as each other could feel their breath. She smiled tenderly at him and whispered to him. "You can be whatever you want, Izuku. If your wish is to be a hero, then I'll support you as much as I can. But that doesn't means I won't be worried." It was one of those rare moments when the Nakomata was opening her heart to the boy, letting him see that caring side of her. A slight, tired smile was on Izuku's face as his eyes closed. His head leaning on Kuroka's shoulder, he mumbled out loud. "I wish that I was born from your world, it seems a lot more peaceful and fair." Kuroka was surprised by this revelation, feeling hesitant about her answer. She never told him about the supernatural or even about herself that much. Even so, she smiled at him as her hand was caressing his hair, stroking it gently. "Yeah, I bet your life would have gone better there, but I don't think it's so bad either. I mean, we met each other, and I'm so thankful for this. I was able to feel love from someone else than my sister." With the two embracing each other, they spent the rest of their lunchtime in this position. Izuku smiled in his sleep, feeling relieved to have someone like Kuroka in his life, even if she could be such a tease at times. But that's just part of her charm, and he couldn't deny that he somehow enjoyed those teases. Eventually, the bell rang, announcing that the lunch break was now over. With the first bell ringing, it meant that the students had around 10 minutes to get to their class for their last class of the day. Hearing it, the two slowly woke up as Izuku was the first one to fully wake up, a reflex on his part as he was able to sleep instantly for a short amount of time, just so he can recover a little bit of energy to continue with his day. Kuroka woke up not long after him as she saw from the window on the door the numerous shadow of the students walking in the hall. "Looks like it's time for you to survive to your last class." She giggled saying that, getting off the boy. With Izuku slowly standing up, he yawned loudly while stretching his body up. He still had that tired look, but he looked like he could still manage to stay up for the rest of the day. "Yeah, survive is a strong word." Chuckling, he picked up his backpack as Kuroka transformed into her cat form, jumping into his bag as Izuku zipped it but not fully, allowing it for her to get out of his bag if she wanted to. With that, Izuku waited that there were not many students just outside the door as he closed it behind him. Looking around, he saw that most of them were already in their classroom, leaving him about 3 minutes before the second bell rang, meaning the beginning of the lesson. Continuing to walk through the halls, he finally arrived at his class, nearly in time for the second bell to happen, with him seating at his place. The teacher gave him a stare that he fully understood well. He was almost late, with the teacher almost looking disappointed that he hadn't arrived late. "Good to see you in time, Mr. Midoriya." The class snickered at this as Katsuki was looking at him with a scowl on his face, looking annoyed just by his presence. Looking at the teacher, Izuku lowered his head and just sighed. Thanks." There was a moment of silence as the teacher stared at him, before continuing with the lesson. The class was going smoothly as it was just some last-minute lesson before letting the class go early. There were still about 45 minutes left to school, but they were still allowed to leave. With that, the students were grouped with their friends, talking about their plans for the summer as some were about to go hit the karaoke. Others were going to the arcade before going home and playing games with their friends. As for Izuku, he was holding his notebook in his hand and his phone in the other. There was some fight this morning? Ah, I didn't have the time to go and see the outcome since I was busy this morning. I should take it home when I get home. As Izuku was about to put his notebook into his backpack, it suddenly was snatched away by none other than Katsuki Bakugo, fanning the book over his face with a sly smirk on his face. We're not finished, Deku. Along with Katsuki, were Irrelevant Bully 1 and Irrelevant Bully 2 as they snickered at Bakugo's comment. Izuku tried to get his notebook from his hands, but due to the height difference, Izuku just couldn't take it. What's that? Hero Analysis 101? What a nerd! One of the irrelevant bullies said, but due to how inexistent they are, we couldn't tell who was talking there. The other says Midoriya's name in a tone of pity as he just laughs at the scene that was unfolding. Izuku was getting worried, it was his hard work after all, and he didn't want this to go to waste. He looked at Bakugo and laughed nervously. It's fine, isn't it? Just give it back. As Izuku was about to reach the notebook, Katsuki slammed his hand over the notebook, creating an explosion as the book was now burnt, with a small flame being ignited from the right corner of the book. And no, Izuku's sight was focused on the book as it caught fire in a short moment. He tried to jump and get it, but Katsuki threw it over the window as it dropped into a pond of water. Izuku looked out the window, in utter defeat and sadness. My book, but Katsuki wasn't finished just yet as he put pressure on his hand on Izuku's shoulder, making black smoke emitting out of the palm that was on his shoulder. Hissing in pain, Izuku's attention was on Katsuki and his smirk only widened. Most top-rate heroes have stories about the way back to their school days. I want to shine the most being able to be the only one at this pathetic and mediocre city junior high school to graduate and get accepted to UA. Putting more pressure on his shoulder, the black smoke just intensifies as Izuku squirms, trying to get off his hold, but to no avail. The pain was excruciating for him, feeling his uniform sticking to his skin as it heat up to a high level of temperature. He looked up at Katsuki with small tears coming from the corner of his eyes. Anyway nerd, don't apply to UA, got it? Smiling widely at the boy, he let him go as Izuku slumped to the ground, his hand over his shoulder as his eyes were closed, trying to reduce the pain at least by just thinking of something else. Hearing the footsteps of his three bullies, he thought it was finally finished, but the voice of Katsuki resonated in his ears. The next thing his bully said, was just cross the line for the boy, as it was something that no one had to say. You know Deku, if you want to be a hero that badly, there is a quick way to go. Just believe you'll be born with a quirk in your next life, and take a last chance by diving off the roof. This was the last straw for Izuku. He thought times and times again that he'll change, that Katsuki would try to be nicer to him, seeing how he suffer, but to wish death to him? It seems that there was no redemption past that point. Izuku tried to stand up, looking at the explosion user with both fear and anger, but it took only one glare from him to make Izuku slump down to the ground again as his group of bullies leave the classroom. In his backpack, was Kuroka as she heard everything from the beginning, sensing the boy's pain, mental and physical. She never felt so much anger towards someone ever since that time. Jumping out of his backpack, Kuroka reached out the window and looked down, seeing that his notebook was floating in a pond of water as fishes were nibbling on it. Turning back to him, she just saw him standing there, staring into nothingness as she frowned. She hated seeing him in this kind of state, in such a mess. Taking her Nakomata form, she jumped out of the window and she reached for his notebook, waving out at the fishes. Taking the notebook, she opened the pages and it was as she feared, the writing was melting down with the water. What was a book full of notes, is now a mess, completely inhibited by water. From afar, she could see Katsuki walking with his friends, laughing to himself as they headed to the arcade. Just seeing him, made her seethe her teeth in anger as she held the notebook so tight, it threatened to tear. Her nails started to appear as they went through the book, ready to jump and go on a slaughter directly at these kids. Fortunately, Izuku's hand went over hers as she immediately turned to him, her expression softening as she sighed. She gave him the ruined notebook. It was the most she could do at this point. Even if she tries to tell him everything will work out fine, nothing is sure about how he'll react. Come on Kuroka, we have to go home. His voice, filled with emptiness, made her nod as she took her cat form and slid in his backpack as he started to walk at a slow pace toward a tunnel. The walk was mostly silent. Izuku focused on his thoughts as he looked down at his notebook, now unusable due to his tormentors. But in a way, he wasn't angry, since it has been so long ago, that he promised himself that it'll be his first and last setback. At the time I was diagnosed as quirkless when everything was so simple. But now, I know the harsh reality of this world. Yeah, this world is unfair to people like me. Why was it that people like me are the ones that suffer the most when people like Bakugo have everything going on for them? Izuku smiles to himself, but it wasn't just a sad smile, no, it was an exhausted one. Exhausted by the unfairness of the struggles he has so far. He just wanted to escape it all. Walking in the tunnel, he could see graffiti showing hate for the quirkless, wishing death upon them, in all sorts of ways. Everywhere he was going, it was the same thing. As he continues to walk, he felt something creeping out behind him. He slowly turned back to see what it was, only for it to be jumped by some sort of dark green goo. As the goo was approaching him, Izuku looked at it in utter fear and tried to stand up, but he immediately fell to the ground, his legs too weak to stand up. As he crawled away, the goo popped 2 eyes and a mouth as it grinned, looking at him. Ah, medium-sized shield, this should do the trick. Thanks to you, I'll get away from him. In the few seconds that this happened, Izuku knew that he couldn't save himself for this one, he was doomed at that moment. But he won't endanger his friend for that, and he had faith in Kuroka. With this in mind, just a slight moment before the goo reached him, Izuku quickly unstrapped his backpack, letting it fall on the ground, as the sludge forced itself in Izuku's mouth. Trying to get a hold of the villain, Izuku put his hands on the goo, but all it did was grab liquid, which was utterly futile. Ha ha ha. I'm made of liquid, there's no way you can grab onto something that isn't solid, kid. Thanks though, you're totally my hero. As the sludge forced himself deeper into Izuku's body, the boy found himself to be unable to breathe, or hardly breathe at all. He even felt something draining him. Desperately trying to cling to his life, he tried to get the villain out of his body, but any action was useless. Is this how I'll die? I don't want to. Not when she's here. All the while this happened, the bag that was behind Izuku started to move as the black cat went out of the bag. Its eyes widened at the scene as it immediately transformed into her human form. Though seeing the scene, Kuroka used senjutsu to conceal her presence, so as to not alarm the villain of her presence. With this in mind, she makes use of her power and uses Jujutsu magic to create an illusion of all might. Thanks to her knowledge of this world after the many years spent here. Seeing the villain's focus on the illusion as it was frantically trying to get into Izuku, she enveloped herself in ki. Doing so, she strengthens herself to a superhuman level and even higher. As her presence was still concealed, the sludge couldn't react when she took hold of its eyes, pressing it harder in her hands as the sludge let out a scream of agony, letting go of Izuku for a slight second. This was enough for Kuroka to pull him to her embrace, getting him out of the way. The sludge was now on the ground, feeling the pain of her eyes getting squeezed. He looked at Kuroka as she made herself visible. But when Kuroka looked at the sludge, there was something wrong with him. It was just that she detected no ki inside him, as if it was just a simple body of sludge, devoid of consciousness and mind. It was most likely dead in her eyes, as her priority was on the boy beside her now. The villain went into the manhole that was close to the entrance of the tunnel, as Kuroka and Izuku were now alone. It was only then that she sensed an important blood loss inside him. She began to panic and lay him on the ground, her hands lowering over him, emitting a faint light as she tried to heal him the most she could. Kuroka didn't understand why Izuku lost blood. She remembers that the sludge villain was suffocating him, and that's when it hit her, the sludge villain must have been absorbing Izuku's blood as he was suffocating. Izuku's eyes were weak, looking up at the Nico girl silently crying as she desperately was trying to heal her. But since this kind of magic only works with skin contact, the process was a lot longer and less effective. But Kuroka was in a state of desperation, not wanting to lose him. She didn't want to lose anyone again. She promised herself that in their first meeting. Every time Izuku was trying to breathe, there was a barrier that restrained him from doing so, making him have a hard time breathing, as he was slowly drowning in his own blood. As a way to slow down the process, Izuku coughed up an important amount of blood to the ground as a trail of it slid to the side of his mouth. This only fueled Kuroka to save him at all costs as she ripped his uniform open, putting her hands on him. As she was sobbing, trying to comfort him, Izuku couldn't hear her completely as he looked up at him, his eyes heavy as he just wanted to sleep. Suddenly, the image of a raven-haired girl tied in twin tails, wearing a magical girl outfit came to mind. He was puzzled by it, but it was as if he could remember this woman clearly. Why do I remember her just now? Raven hair, flowing to the rhythm of her movement, her purple eyes shone through the scene as she was smiling to the whole crowd. It was a show I used to watch, Miracle Leviathan. I wish I could see her one more time. I have much to say to her. It was just then, at his last breath, that a purple light shone through the tunnel as a woman with twin tails and some sort of magical girl outfit showed up. I am the mouse Seraphal Leviathan. And from now on, you'll be my servant, but have no fear, I'll take great care of you. Since the incident with Izuku happened and the apparition of the strange Seraphal Leviathan, no sign of Izuku was seen prior to that day. Before saying that Inko Midoriya, his mother was quite worried for the past days that followed, as she tried to get as much information as possible about her baby boy. But as Izuku had little to no friends, no one really knew where he was. As she asked Katsuki Bakugo where her son was, his expression was one of annoyance, but it quickly became one of surprise and worry. He remembered saying those harsh words to the boy just after school ended, but it wasn't like he meant them. So, Katsuki scoffed it out and just said to Inko that he didn't know where the nerd was. While that was true, Katsuki himself couldn't let that go, even if he knew that he wasn't worth a damn. He just couldn't forget the only person who kept chasing him, despite knowing what kind of person Katsuki became. He knew something wrong might have happened, and even in the midst of his training for UA and all the other stuff he had to do, Katsuki went to do some research on his own, believing that this nerd was still alive and well somehow even after the police found a pond of blood that contained Izuku's blood. Katsuki wouldn't give up on anything. But without Izuku not being in the picture anymore, a fateful meeting never happened, as well as a promise between the symbol of peace and a hero fanboy who wanted nothing more than to save people. A lot of things would then change, and it wasn't for the best, not at all. But let's go back to our protagonist now. In a dimly lit room, the boy was unconscious in quite the large bed as he was faintly breathing, but he was overall doing well. There was no real sign of blood, nor of battle, as it was as if nothing happened. But of course that would be too easy, as the boy lost a large amount of blood. With that in mind, he needed his body to recover the amount of blood, hence why he was unconscious at the moment, for the time being. At the entrance of the room, a raven-haired girl that was tied in twin tails was watching the boy with a look of worry. She didn't know him much, but she couldn't help it. There was just something about the boy that drew her to him. Her eyes focused on the boy, she knew that he'd be doing better, and she had another matter that she needed to handle. So, with her hand on the handle, she looked back at Izuku for a second. "Please wake up soon, Izuku-chan," she smiled softly at the unconscious state of the boy, closing the door behind her as Kuroka was just outside the door, her hands folding under her chest, emphasizing them even more. She looked at the girl with a frown, but it didn't last long as she sighed to herself. This wasn't her, to worry about someone so much. Is he going to be better? The girl just before Kuroka giggled softly as she nodded vigorously with a peace sign. Of course. He's a strong boy after all. Now, let's discuss somewhere more private. Kuroka nodded as she had her thoughts about what they were gonna talk about. But Seraphal might be the best person she could encounter that day, along with the other Devil King, Surzek Lucifer. Following Seraphal to the room joint from the one Izuku was in, Kuroka closed the door behind her and took a seat beside Seraphal, as the girl looked at her with a serious look. Now, what's an ultimate class rogue devil doing with a human? It's a miracle that you haven't killed him yet, right? Seraphal was no longer the cheerful woman that she was just a moment ago. This was a serious matter as a Devil King, so she had to act like it. Kuroka first chuckled, finding it ironic how a criminal of her level would be lowered to live with a human. Despite that, she doesn't have any remorse or shame in doing so, she never will. Keeping her composure, Kuroka slightly smirked as she put her hand under her chin, tapping it as she looked up like she was thinking. "Well, I guess I'll have to tell you how this all started, huh?" Seraphal, while being on guard, couldn't help but be curious. If she was a criminal of her level, she'd have no problem escaping her. Was Kuroka after something? Maybe she was just protecting the boy, but Seraphal couldn't just get to that conclusion. Everything could happen at this very moment. At the same time, she was definitely curious about the boy and his world. Who would not, as she had a glimpse of things when she got there and was summoned by Izuku. It was a clear day, in the middle of the afternoon when the boy was attacked by some sludge person. Well, that was what Kuroka was saying. She could lie too, but Seraphal decided to trust her for the moment. She'll have to ask questions to the boy afterward when he'll wake up. It all started around a decade ago when I killed my old master from the Nibirius household. Seraphal knew that day all too well, as it was then that Kuroka Tuju was declared as a stray devil from the underworld, an ultimate class as that. But what was strange was that not even a day after this, Kuroka disappeared from everyone's eyes, without leaving any traces. It was as if she wasn't from this world anymore. There was a flashback as we see a young Kuroka, covered in blood. She was in the basement of the house of her master, panting as she wiped some of the blood she had on her face. Despite this, she doesn't seem to be disgusted, but she had a lot of remorse, but not for the murder she had committed. She looked back at the stairs that led to the surface, but she shook her head, knowing her fate was already sealed. Chiron. I'll come back one day, I promise you that. Looking ahead of her, she saw that her old master had quite a collection of weird objects and creations that he was doing during his free time. It made her frown as the image of her old master played in her mind. She walked past all of them, in the hope to find something that would help her. Going through the room, most of these objects/creations were imbued with advanced magic, but there was something that was emitting a greater amount of advanced magic, though this one was at the other end of the room, which Kuroka was going at the moment. Even on the walls, there was some kind of shadow figure, but Kuroka already knew what it was from the start. It was for this reason that she decided to slaughter him and free her little sister in the process. Using living beings for his experiments, what a sick man he was. Her tone was spitting with venom, having a clear hatred for her old master. After some moments, Kuroka finally reached the end of the room, and what she saw was something that she would never think would have been possible unless under certain circumstances. Approaching it, there was a giant circle emitting all kinds of light ranging from green to blue, all the way to purple and yellow. Every second, a new color appeared. The amount of magic is almost suffocating. Having a hard time concentrating, Kuroka used her senjutsu to increase herself, making her able to at least withstand it for a moment. Even an ultimate class like her could barely stand on her feet before such a huge amount of magic. Walking toward some kind of control panel next to the magic circle, Kuroka looked to have more details about it, but as she read the first few words, she understood something that could be her last hope of freedom at this point. Transdimensional teleportation magic, TTM. In reality, traveling through dimensions would be impossible unless under some requirement and a summon request. But this machine somehow bypasses the requirement, but the downside of it was that the destination at the other end of the circle was unknown. It can be any dimension that there is? But for Kuroka, she didn't really care where she ended up. It was selfish of her to think like that, but she is sure that her little sister Chiron will be in good hands. She took a last look at the circle that was emitting all sorts of colors, with different logos of clans from the 72 pillars, even some that the bloodline disappeared. Taking a deep breath, she started the machine as the control panel indicated a countdown of 10 seconds before the teleportation process. There was no going back for her, it was her last chance to live the life that she wanted. One that she can be free of her shackles and far from her past. Standing in the middle of the circle, the control panel indicated 0 as the magic circle's light intensified tenfold before it blinded Kuroka the next second. She wasn't there anymore, any trace of the Nakomata was now gone from this world. Mustafa, Japan, 2XXX. In the middle of the night, there were few people that were walking the streets as the light of the cars was clearly visible under the moon. While most people were asleep at this moment of the day, some had to go work while others had some business to attend. Though, one clear difference was their appearance. Meanwhile, in a dimly illuminated park, a sudden phenomenon occurred for a fraction of seconds. While no one could see what was going on by how fast it was happening, many of them described it as a blinding show of colors and a faint shadow of a cat in the middle of it. But this wasn't the weirdest thing that could happen around, so the people just continued with their business they had to attend. While no one was looking, we could see a black cat with two tails walking in the park, but getting close to the cat, you could notice its legs trembling. It wasn't long before Kuroka took her real form as she was panting, being on her all four. What felt like an eternity, only passed a couple of seconds before the teleportation ended. Although this was true, Kuroka felt like most of her energy was drained by the device. Groaning, she took some time to recover a part of her energy as she concentrated her ki to be able to at least get to somewhere safe for the night. When doing so, she found an abandoned building, as she entered it, and found somewhere where she could spend the night. It took around a dozen minutes, but she did find a suitable place for her to recover and get some sleep. Sitting down, she looked up at the fissured roof, where a part of the moon could be seen to her. Shining brightly, Kuroka couldn't help but smile. Let's see what this new opportunity will offer me, Naya. Time skip. It has been around a month since Kuroka was in this new world and she was quite surprised by the difference. She didn't think that it would feel so different, but after some time spent in this world, Kuroka got accustomed to the difference between this world and hers. But it did take some time as her first day was quite unnerving for the Nikomata. She knew that the supernatural would most likely not be a thing here, but she didn't predict that it would be something entirely different. Walking to the streets, she could see all sorts of people, all looking different, more than she thought. Some even resemble more animals than humans. But even so, everyone seemed to not mind this at all. Kuroka wasn't expecting this, as the supernatural was something that must stay a secret among humans, so as to not stir up conflicts with them. But here, everything seemed so peaceful and calm, well, for the most part. At the same time, it was a relief for her, as she could walk aimlessly with her tails and cat ears without getting worried about what people would say. She liked the feeling of being out there without a care in the world and just enjoying the day like everyone around her. It even brought her a smile seeing she could be this free after she just killed someone only a couple of days ago. Spending the next few weeks gathering information about this world, Kuroka gained the necessary knowledge of this world to know what was really going on with everyone. From what she could gather, those were abilities that people have, commonly called quirks. It wasn't everyone that has this, but enough to say that those who don't consider it to be rare. We are talking here about a ratio of 80-20, in favor of people having quirks. Though, this was a fairly new phenomenon, as it only started around 2 centuries ago, with the first quirk person being a baby that emitted light. Ever since then, people gained abilities that could be anything from some of the most powerful quirks to the power to just have a longer nose. But people didn't decide on what quirks they would have, since they were born with this. So if you had a useless power, you were pretty much stuck with it for the rest of your life. Adding to that, every quirk had its drawbacks, so even if you have a powerful ability, it would come with a high risk, something that Kuroka knew would make sense. After all, everything should be balanced as such. Now for the interesting part, Kuroka learned that during a stroll to the city, there was a crowd of people gathering near the train station as a guy with a quirk used it to steal people's money. She found it dumb at first that people wouldn't intervene, as she was sure many people would have the advantage as the guy had such a weak quirk, well, from what she could see. But she understood this fast as some guy in a costume arrived at the scene and fought the guy quite easily. What followed that was the crowd cheering for the victory of the guy that won the fight. She was perplexed by that as she asked a person in the crowd about what just happened. The person explained that the hero just won over this villain that tried to steal money. The word hero and villain resonated in her head until it clicked to her. It was just like those in the comics that Chiron usually would read in her alone time. The person added that the heroes are also remunerated for the crimes they stopped, according to their fame. This only fueled her interest to know more about this new information. Searching about it more, she found that there were a lot of people out there exercising this new job, hero. It was simple and pretty self-explanatory in fact. Depending on the degree of crimes you stopped and the fame of the public, the government would pay you for every crime you'd stopped. While Kuroka was slightly excited by the idea of it, she knew that a lot of them wouldn't do it for the safety of the citizens, but more about fame and money. Kuroka knew firsthand how greedy humans and even devils can be. So, it didn't surprise her that some heroes would overlook small crimes like assault and even rape. The more the villain is powerful, the higher they get paid. It's a vicious circle that most people would just ignore, as at the end of the day, the heroes always win. It was all that mattered to them. Sure, there were some exceptions to that, but they were very few to think so. For this, Kuroka decided it was best to just stay away from this, as she just wanted to live peacefully. This gets her to that day where she'll make an important decision. It was a day like any other as she was walking through the road that led to a park. It was currently the afternoon as school just ended, so it wasn't rare to see kids swarming the roads at this time of the day. This didn't bother Kuroka, as she was used to this. While she was walking toward the abandoned building she was living in right now, she heard a commotion at the park. She could see 3 kids surrounding a kid on the ground as there was a green-haired kid standing in front of him. As she stopped on her track, she went to see what was going on with these kids at the moment. Changing the scene to the park, we see a young Izuku standing in front of a kid that was on the ground, sniffing and crying to himself as he had a look of terror on his face. Meanwhile, in front of Izuku were 3 boys, as one could be identified as his old friend now turned into his main tormentor, Katsuki Bakugu. Beside Katsuki, were 2 other boys. One had long nails and the other was a fat guy with red wings that could barely support him. With the two boys behind Katsuki, with their quirks activated, Katsuki punched his left palm and a small explosion occurred, with black smoke coming out of his hands. "Get out of the way, Deku. You should do so if you know what's good for you." While Katsuki was saying this, Izuku's body was trembling and there was a clear look of fear in his eyes. It wasn't that Izuku knew he'd win, but he took a quick glance behind him and saw that the kid looked so defenseless. He couldn't just let that kid be hurt, but what could he really do? "Why you're hurting him, Kaken?" Izuku's voice was the opposite of the arrogant tone of Katsuki. Izuku's was a soft tone that could give a sensation of calm and safety to people. Well, that would be the case, but in this situation, Izuku was at a clear disadvantage. If you don't stop, I'll stop you myself." There was a moment of silence, as Izuku took a position of fight, ready to get anything that would come at him. Seeing him standing his ground made Katsuki grit his teeth in annoyance as he stared at him with anger. His hands emitted smoke as a slight crackle was heard from his palm. "You'll regret it, Deku." As this was happening, Kuroka climbed to a tree nearby and looked to see what was happening from up there. She didn't want to intervene, but the more she was watching the more she felt an uneasy feeling stirring inside her, tearing her apart. As Izuku kept defending the kid that was on the ground. As she saw the kid behind Izuku running away, she understood what it was doing. After all, you should preoccupy your own self before others. But as she looked at Izuku, she was surprised to see that he wasn't moving. Either out of fear or by sheer stupidity. Why isn't he running away like the other kids? Does he have a strong quirk to defend himself? Kuroka was intrigued by the actions of the boy and his belief. As she was still looking at them, the boy with the explosion quirk started to rush to Izuku, along with the two irrelevant bullies. But the Nikomata stood where she was standing, deciding to not intervene. She had her own reason for doing so, despite her worry for the green-haired kid. She had a feeling that she should help him, but she didn't. The sound of explosions, punches, and kicks was heard for several minutes until the tormentors had enough. As they left, Izuku was laying on the ground, covered in bruises and slight burn marks. As he looked at the sky, he couldn't help but let out a sigh as he stayed in this position. But no tears came out of his eyes, as he smiled to himself, something that caught Kuroka off guard as she observed him. She expected him to cry and to say how this was unfair, but all he did was smile. Her gaze softened as she looked at him, having a desire to help him grow stronger within her. Putting his hand on the ground, Izuku forced his body to move as he sat down, wincing at the pain he just received. Looking at himself, he saw the state of his clothes as he had a small frown, his small hand brushing through his burn marks. This boy was unscathed, I'm glad he was. But now I have to explain to Mom why my new shirt was torn off. As he stayed there, Izuku didn't notice the girl that was standing behind him. As he stood there, looking at his bullies disappearing off the scenery, the boy felt a warm sensation on his back as he looked at himself, seeing the bruises slowly fading away as the pain was subsiding a little. Looking back, he was faced with a girl that looked only a few years older than him. She was smiling at the boy and had her hand touching his bare back. Her hands, emitting a faint light, made Izuku's body recover quicker than it would as he felt next to no pain. He was at first surprised by it, as he looked up at the girl with an anxious look. He was pretty shy at the moment as a small blush on his face was proof of that. Who are you? His voice was soft and low, as he avoided her gaze, looking directly at the sand he was sitting on. Kuroka couldn't help but giggle at his reaction, finding them rather cute. She scooted herself closer to him as she sat down, her legs spread on either side of him as she continued to heal him. Does it feel better, Naya? He couldn't deny the warm feeling she was making him feel as well as the sensation of safety as the pain was now gone. There were still some burn marks on his body, but they were very few. Nodding meekly, Izuku turned his head slowly to her as a big smile appeared on his face. This was incredible. What's your Q quirk? His eyes were radiating with wonder and curiosity over Kuroka, as she couldn't help herself but find this rather adorable for a kid like him. Even so, she couldn't help but wonder why he wasn't protecting himself during the fight, even if she had her intuition. It's Nikomata, what's yours? As she asked her own question, Izuku's smile slowly faded as his eyes looked at her in shame, looking at his little hands, feeling dreadful. He then looked up at her, and a sad look appeared on his face. Even so, the boy still tried to smile, but he was unable to. I'm quirkless, stopping her senjutsu on Izuku as he was completely healed. She had her eyes wide and felt guilt within her for not helping him. Nonetheless, she didn't want to worry the boy, so she put a small smile on her face, hugging the boy from behind. thus making his blush deepen in red. It's fine, even if you don't have one, it's still wonderful that you helped this kid earlier. Even when being at a disadvantage, you didn't back down. You held your head high and protected that kid, such a brave boy you are, Naya. Hearing those words, Izuku can't help himself from shedding a few tears, as he was hugged by the woman. At that time, he didn't know that this meeting would change his life for the better. That day, the meeting between a selfless quirkless boy and a lost Nakomata sealed their fate together. As for the next decade, the two of them grew together, with neither of them leaving the other, swearing to never do so. That was the story of Kuroka Tuju, as she met her dearest friend and even more, Izuku Midoriya? As Kuroka finished her story to Serafall as the two were still sitting in the room, Serafall had an expression of understanding. She nodded her head and smiled at Kuroka. The Nakomata felt nervous as to what would happen to Izuku. She wasn't really worried about herself, but his fate mattered the most, not wanting him to return. It was selfish on her part, but as she looked at the woman in front of her, she made a request. Is it possible to make Izuku part of your peerage? It may sound selfish, but I don't want him to return to the life he was living, he deserves better. To that, the girl smiled and took Kuroka's hand, which surprised her. But as she looked up and saw Serafall's expression, she understood that everything would be fine. It was my intention, Kuroka-chan. As soon as he wakes up, I'll ask him. This was what I wanted from the start. Ever since I met him, I felt something special about him, and well, he's pretty cute. But before Kuroka could answer, Serafall pointed her finger to Kuroka, with an excited expression on her face as she exclaimed herself. But in return, I want Kuroka-chan to be my bishop. Time skip 1 week later. A week has passed over the last events that happened in Izuku's life. To say that it took a weird turn would be quite an understatement. Experiencing death, Izuku's last image that his eyes remembered was weird, to say the least. It was also strange that she was the idol and main character of a show he loved to watch while younger, Serafall Leviathan. Right now, Izuku was sitting on the bed, his eyes wandering around the room, which was nothing like he used to be. Living with his single mother, Izuku never lived a life of luxury, but he didn't complain nonetheless, having everything he needed. But what he was seeing now was out of his mind. While trying to concentrate on the last events, the only thought he had was that he would be in heaven at the moment, as she was sure hell had nothing to do with that. The room was mostly bright in color and with quite the girly decoration, but Izuku found it to be rather cute than anything else. Looking around, there was a lot of merchandise about magical girls hanging on the walls and even a uniform of one he recognized easily. Is that Serafall-chan's outfit? His inner fanboy started to show up as the door creaked open, but the boy didn't notice the appearance of the person entering the room. While the person seemed to enjoy his reaction, she was mostly relieved that he was awake as she took a seat beside him as she touched his shoulder. Izuku, while in his thoughts mumbling many things, which most of them weren't comprehensible, was in awe of the room. This can't be. But it all looks so real, so much stuff from Serafall-chan. Is this for real? Even her outfit for the show is there, and there are posters of many shows about magical girls. But I need to calm down. As he tried to get his breath under control, with an excited smile on his face, a hand touched his shoulder and he jumped back in surprise. Turning to his left, there was the girl he was talking about for the last dozen minutes. She offered him a soft smile, but her eyes were showing a sudden interest in the boy as he mentioned the subject of her own show and also about magical girls. Taking his hand, her smile quickly turned to an excited one, but it wasn't why she was here in the first place. But Izuku wasn't aware of that as some sparkle in his eyes was showing, putting Serafall in the middle of it. It's really you. Serafall Leviathan from Miracle Leviathan? Is this for real? Izuku's tone was so honest and soft, filled with excitement that Serafall couldn't resist but hug him instantly, smoldering him between her breasts. Izuku, getting caught off guard by the sudden skin touch, blushed deeply, stammering on his words. Such an honest boy. I'm moved that you like my show. But this wasn't why she was here, as Serafall quickly released the boy, causing Izuku to slightly pant, recovering the air he was losing during this moment. Now, Izuku-chan, what I'm about to talk about will change your life around. So please pay close attention to what I am about to say. Her tone of voice was much more serious, as Serafall turned into a whole 180 on her personality. Izuku seemed to be confused for a second as he slowly nodded, looking at her. There was a moment of silence in the room, as the atmosphere grew dense, making Izuku gulp loudly on his own saliva, feeling nervous as his idol was in front of him. Although this was true, he could sense the seriousness in her words as she was looking at him. As those seconds passed, Serafall started to talk. Let's start with the obvious. You, Izuku Midoriya, are not in your own world at this moment. You are currently in a whole different dimension, where things are slightly different. Serafall just started talking, but Izuku was already taken aback by the news, but he said nothing as his eyes went from confused to a more curious gaze, looking at her as he took a more formal position on the bed. Good, you're taking it very well. Now, in this world, the supernatural exists. Devils, angels, and fallen angels are common things in the world, but it is hidden from the human world. Those are the main factions constituting the supernatural, along with the yokai. Although there are a multitude of others within this world, they are much more secretive and rare to show up. As you could guess, those three factions are made from the biblical god. At that, Serafall stood up as a pair of bat-like wings appeared from her back, stretching them as they flap a few times before settling down as she looked down at Izuku's excited state, which was something she didn't expect him to have. Izuku was looking at them with wonder, but before he could even touch them, Serafall retracted them, making Izuku slightly sad, but he did recover fast. "So, you are a devil?" She nodded in a quick manner, as she held her head high, proud of being what she is. She noticed this look on his face, so she sat down and smiled softly at the boy, making sure to not provoke any reactions as she softly spoke to the boy. Unlike what you might think, not every devil is a cruel creature, feeding on the suffering of people. We just follow what desire we have. If we follow this desire to our heart's content, there are then no limits to what we can accomplish. Ah, I'm glad you said that. Sighing in relief, it was clear that Izuku was afraid just a moment ago. Looking back to when she had her wings out, Izuku was curious about something. Izuku took a moment for himself, thinking of anything that he could ask her, but there were just too many questions. He thinks for another second before looking up at Serafall. Does that mean that magic exists? Izuku asked this as he was way too excited for himself as his last words were said in a higher pitch of tone, making Serafall chuckle. But she was glad that he asked her that. As she nodded her head, she opened her hand and focused a bit on her magic, and then a small ice shard appeared in the palm of her hand, before it disappeared the moment after. This made the boy's eyes open wide. He had seen quirks all his life, so this was certainly not something he was so shocked about, but confirming to him that magic exists. Yeah, that was something that Izuku agreed to be excited to see. That was so cool. See, can I do that too? This was the question that Serafall was waiting for him to ask. She smiled knowing that it was unintentional, but it made it easier for her to enter the next and final topic they'll be discussing today at least. At the moment, no, you have no knowledge about it and you are a simple human, with next to no knowledge about this world. Izuku knew this, as he looked down, wanting to not believe it. But as he was about to shed tears, the girl took his chin on her palm, as she moved his head. Now with Izuku forced to look at her, he saw that she wasn't finished. But you should be able to do it. Although it is possible, this would mean that you'd have to lose your humanity, and become a devil. That would also mean that you'd be part of my peerage, using evil pieces as a way to turn you into a devil. For that purpose, you'll have to be reincarnated, so you'll have to die. Of course, you'll feel nothing during the process, it will last only for a fraction of a second, but that means you have to say goodbye to your old life. Keep in mind that I would not force you into this choice. With that, Serafall took a queen piece out of her pocket and put it next to him, on a desk. She looked at him and smiled, waiting for an answer on his part. Izuku looked at Serafall and then at the piece as he was hesitating strongly. On one hand, this means that he has to live a new lifestyle and become a devil. But how would a devil be a hero? Would I still be able to save people, with a smile? But if devils live for their desire then? As Izuku was thinking of it, images in his mind from the last decades proceed to show up. The years of torment by his old friend, now tormenting him after all these years. The struggle his mother had to go through just for him to be fed. The teachers at his school ignored his attempt to denounce the bullying he was going through. The sheer loneliness he was living in. Kuroka. If Kuroka was here, she would say to stay true to my heart and follow what I desire the most, what I desire. His eyes go wide as he would take a look at Serafall, with tears rolling down his eyes. He knows what he wants, what he desires the most. If he turns to a devil then? Even when I'll be a devil, going through all this, do you think I could be a hero? His hopeful and watery eyes looked at Serafall. She smiled as her hands went around his back as she put his head on his shoulder, hugging him. Of course Izuku-chan, whatever you desire, I'll be supporting you not only as your king but as your friend. You don't have to go through this alone and be so desperate. Whatever you choose, I'll respect it. Hearing those words, Izuku's choice was simple. As he wiped the tears from his face, he broke the hug and took the queen piece in his hand, holding it close to his heart. Through his tears, Izuku showed Serafal a smile filled with hope and immense relief. Then, please make me a devil. Please give me a purpose for my new life and help me through this journey. I want to be a devil. To that, Serafal smiled softly, looking at the door behind which a certain Nakomata was waiting for the boy. Then, why don't you go with my new bishop? She was waiting for you to wake up.